All you need to know to start your day. Power Breakfast on Power 98.7.
The time is 8:43. You're still on Power Breakfast on this kind of 2.0 Freedom Day. Yesterday was Freedom Day, and we've been talking about our freedom, but we've also been talking about apartheid, really galvanized into a conversation about the comparisons between apartheid and our current modern-day South Africa, by some of our callers saying, you know, we mustn't, I think it was Litsiba earlier that said on Twitter, we must not misinform our children about apartheid. And thinking that what's happening today is not as bad as what was happening during apartheid. And so that's a good segue into a conversation that we want to have about a new book that's come out, Together Apart, the story of living in apartheid, a new book for young readers that explains the system of racism during apartheid. On the line with us, we have Dr. Athambile Masola, who is the lecturer at Historical Studies at the Department of History at UCT. Dr. Masola, welcome to Power Breakfast. Tell us about this book. Who is it aimed at, and what is its core message?
Hi, Tessa. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you so much for bringing up this conversation in such a timely way. So the book is called Together Apart, as you said, and I've co-written it with my friend and colleague, Olisa Kuzula. And the idea is exactly that. How do we explain the story of living in apartheid with an 8-year-old, with a 10-year-old, with a 12-year-old in mind? Mm. And even as you say, and I love to could hear listen in on your intro and your previous segments as well, about someone saying, you know, let's not lie to our children about apartheid. And I think our book is responding exactly to that. I think for a long time, parents have been like, well, then how do we tell the story about apartheid to our children? And the approach that we take is that we have fictional characters. We have uMakhulu speaking to 4 children. And these are fictional children and a fictional Makhulu, but simulating how adults could be having this conversation, but also using questions and scenarios that Oli and I have actually found ourselves in through our work with children, Oli's own children and nieces and nephews and all of that, who are actually asking questions. And I think that's the beauty about children, is one thing I guarantee, they will ask the questions. The challenge is we, the adults in their lives, are often the ones who disappoint them by either lying to them or telling them half-truths or evading. And all 3 of those have their own problems. And so this book is to say, you know what, we got you. You don't have to do this on your own. You don't have to fumble through. And so the book is framed along these characters. Each chapter begins with a conversation that these characters come after school. The children are coming after school, and they tell uMakhulu what was happening at school or what they learned at school in relation to history. And Makhulu says, oh, my gosh, let me tell you about how that actually came about, right? And Makhulu is always just like, what had happened was in the most kind of, you know, just well-rounded, but also kind of everyday thing, you know? So it's like the history is there in the street names. The history is there in the schools that children go to. The history is there in the homes where children live. But how do we tie it together with the contemporary and the historical?
And I love the figure of Makhulu and this idea of simulating a conversation, right? So you're almost role-playing it through the book. But the point that you make about our parents and our parents' generation, where they weren't always comfortable having difficult conversations. They weren't always comfortable telling us the history as it was. And so, you know, sometimes it would be hard to get that information out. My dad is from a family of women who lived to be very old. And one of them, his aunt's still alive now in her 90s. And I remember at the 100th birthday of one of his aunts, my sisters and I kind of looked at each other and we saw these 4 old ladies sitting on a couch together, and we were like, let's go and attack now. Let's go to ask all the questions we've ever wanted to ask. And so that conjures up, Makhulu conjures up that picture of, you know, Auntie Margaret in my head, of Auntie Elizabeth in my head, and, you know, going to a Makhulu. But I guess the question here is, for the Makhulus of today, who find themselves desperately disappointed with South Africa as it is, does the book help navigate that question about the comparison between the then and the now?
Yeah, I mean, the Makulas of today, and I imagine you're thinking about people almost in their 60s and 70s who probably came of age in the 80s and then were adults in the 90s and had all these grand plans and have also then watched the demise. And sometimes I often feel quite sorry for them, not in the way that I'm laughing. It's quite tragic, actually, to have been those people in that generation. And I think what we try to do, and we do it right at the end, and I think in other snippets as well, you know, we talk about the kids asked Makulu what she would have wanted to be when she was younger. And she said, well, I was a nurse, but that's not necessary. Those were just the options available to me. But right at the end, the book tries to take on a kind of a hopeful, but kind of like open-ended position where we say, well, is apartheid really over? And I think that's an intervention for the Makulus who have seen this whole route to be like, yes, it is over. And I've had friends in that age group who have been like, stop that. It is over. You can only ask us that question, actually. And my mother's also one of those Makulus who's just like, no, it is over. But we're disappointed.
Yeah.
And I think having a vehicle to talk about those disappointments, I think there's also a kind of healing that they probably need. There's, I think, a psychological trauma that we don't know how to talk about, and we kind of think very exaggerated to even call it a psychological trauma. But there is a psychological trauma in this country amongst that generation. And even those of us who are younger than them who were hopeful come 1991 were the guinea pigs of the 1994 project. So the story ends with 1994 because we're still constantly reflecting on the last 30 years. And I mean, the book is kind of framed around that. But I hope it will be a tool for them to say, look, I mean, we end on that famous quote by President Thabo Mbeki, a two-nation speech.
Yeah.
Which for me is still so vivid. I use it over and over again because it still gives me a language to articulate the inequality. And if we ever stop talking about the historical consequences of inequality, that's when we'll know we've really lost it. Or the historical consequences of anything, really, of the gender-based violence, of where we live, of spatial inequality and all of that. And we stop talking about that, then we have a problem. But I think what we try and do in the book, I mean, a simple scene that we described is the kids have had a sports day at school, and they're describing other kids from the township coming to their school to play sports. Have we not all experienced this? I suppose.
Absolutely. And that's apartheid spatial planning playing itself out. And you're looking at, you know, the one of the concepts that you learn in sociology is called ruination. You're looking in the ruins of apartheid. So you're playing in the ruins of apartheid as you're growing up as a kid in this society. But it does lead me to another point that I love about the book, is that the book isn't about these big political stories. It's not a book about Tambo. And as important as Tambo is as a figure, it is also a book about kind of the day-to-day experiences, this idea that the personal is political. It's personal stories you're telling, not kind of just the big, grand political story.
Absolutely. And I think that's another way, I think, in which parents can and grandparents can also get an inroad into that, is that they too were affected by apartheid. Apartheid wasn't only Sharpeville. Apartheid wasn't only 1976, as important as those moments are. And I think it's wonderful that we have these public holidays to mark that. But I think one of the most powerful things that my mother did was to use just the everyday. So she would often be shocked when we moved to the burbs about how easily we would chat to our white friends. Like, yo, this thing was never supposed to happen. Or she would see a black person and a white person driving in a car together, and the white person is driving and the black person is sitting on the front seat. She said, that's like a very everyday thing. She's like, that would never happen during apartheid. Or she would see white people coming into the queue and joining the queue. And that one used to tickle her endlessly. She's like, oh, they must be very disturbed. They used to never stand in queues.
Yeah.
Those were everyday, mundane things
Absolutely.
that we take for granted. So I think there's an opportunity, and we try and capture that in the book as well. And I mean, we talk about how apartheid affected friendships, how apartheid affected movements. I mean, the fact that FEDSAW, the Federation of South African Women, was formed around, you know, the friendships and of these women. We talk about 1956 March, but we don't talk about how Dr Hamana and Lillian Ngoyi had to go to a conference overseas and were helped by their friends who helped them sleep over in Cape Town so they could get on the ship the next morning and be able to go
100%.
to that conference, which was part of the big story of what FEDSO is. So behind the political moments are actually everyday moments of people making very everyday decisions that we're still faced with today.
No, and I think that's a very, very pertinent one. I'm thinking about Lillian Ngoyi in the context of that big 20,000 women march to the union buildings. I mean, in today's terms, when we play political optics, 20,000 people doesn't sound that much anymore. But in a time where there was no Twitter, there was no social media, there was no nothing, and women were relatively more oppressed than they are now. 20,000 women finding each other in Pretoria was no small feat. That must have taken so much social networking and social ties and relationships and friendships and trust and sharing of resources. And, you know, the kind of activism that we see today is people are like, oh, unless we have 20,000 Rand, we can't even hold a meeting. Unless we, you know, so many lessons to be learned from those day-to-day struggles. As we wrap up the conversation, how can people access this book, and what's the age range that is preferred for the children this is targeted at?
So the book is available in all bookstores at the moment. I'll name my favorites: Book Circle, Capital, Book Lounge, Clark's here in Cape Town, and the big chains, Exclusive Books, Bargain Books, as well as Jacana's website. And Ethnic Kids as well just did a review of ours actually on Instagram, and that you can buy those online. And you know the age range, I keep saying to people, the age range is almost like Shrek. Remember Shrek? We could watch it as the adults and the kids could also watch it.
One of my favorite movies.
Exactly. So think about it in that way. This book is for everyone. This book is for parents. It is for children. We kind of say it's for children as a shorthand to kind of get the conversation going. But ideally, it's not the kind of book a child should be reading on their own. It's the kind of book a child should be reading with an adult nearby to be like, oh my gosh, I've learned this thing. Please break it down for me. Or an adult sitting right next to them, or teachers in the classroom. So we're really hoping that, parents get involved, schools get involved. Schools can invite us to come and speak to them as well. This book is for everyone. But typically, if a child is reading it on their own, we had in mind a 10-year-old going up.
I'd love us to think about a partnership here, and I'll challenge our producers to do this with you. We have got a slot called Power Kids, and perhaps it would be great to have the Power Kids read from your book in some of the segments that we do. So I'll challenge Anati and Tanika to think about how do we create a collaboration here with Together Apart and the Power Kids of the Power family. I think it would be a really cool thing to do. But thank you so much. That's Dr. Athambile Masola, a lecturer at the Historical Studies Department at UCT. Thank you to you and your co-author, Kholi, for giving us this gift, giving us this way that we can have and start conversations, difficult conversations, not only with the children, but with each other. We've been talking about the national dialogue as well last week that is in the making, as it were. I really do believe we need to talk more as South Africans. I'll end today with a personal story. So I wrote a book as well called Coloured: How Classification Became Culture. And the last and the first chapter about my father, how he lost his name through apartheid, taking away his name through the classification process. But the last chapter is a story about us as a family when my father was 79, just before his 80th birthday. And he took us to his village. He drove us down a long, dusty road. And he kept telling us, look for tall trees and rocks. And we're like, tall trees and rocks? What are you talking about? There are tall trees and rocks everywhere. But my father vividly had this childhood memory of tall trees and rocks and him playing with his white friend who came from a farm called Naples. And you will not believe that as my father mentioned Naples, we saw Naples. And so the white farm that my father's friend lived at had stayed even though their village was demolished. And so he could mark his home based on where the white family got to stay afterwards. And so when you say apartheid wasn't that bad and what we're experiencing now is bad, my father lost his name to apartheid. He was born Lesole, and he had to give up that name for Elliot to have some better privileges in that society. So let's not forget about the human sacrifices that were made in the struggle for this country to be better. I'm going to leave you this morning with love and revolution as always, with a call for us to stand up and change things on our own terms, learn from history and the past, but let's focus on the future with the young people leading the way.